So I want to start off with a farewell address from President Eisenhower. In his last speech, he talked about something called the military-industrial complex. I want to quote a passage from that speech. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. In Germany, when US foreign policy is analyzed or reported, there's little to no mention of the military-industrial complex. Can you briefly tell us what the military-industrial complex is, its history, and what scale and scope it possesses today?
Well, I mean, first of all, you have to understand that when Eisenhower was president, was right as what is known historically as the Cold War was just gearing up, and the United States had never had the scope of military power that it ended up with because of World War II. And what happened at that time in the United States in the late 1930s, early 1940s, and then on through the present, is that the US political system ended up becoming intertwined with for-profit war making. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that the US government implemented a system where huge corporations could have monopolies on very devastating weapons systems. Their biggest client would be the United States. And what Eisenhower was talking about was that when you empower these corporations, today Lockheed Martin, for instance, could go to war against almost any nation in the world, and it's a private corporation. When those corporations have their profits linked not to a breakout of peace, but to a spreading of war, it's going to fundamentally shift what is the most sacred duty of a nation state through the mainstream lens, which is the decision to go to war. And in turn, what ended up happening was that these very large war corporations began funding the political campaigns of both the Democratic and Republican parties, to the point where the politicians in Washington, almost down to the last one, are all sponsored by corporate interests in what is effectively a legalized form of bribery and corruption in the United States. So we now have a situation where drone warfare is very pervasive, where drones are getting smaller, where we're talking about robotic warfare, where the US does not need to subject its troops to the kinds of risks it did in previous wars, because you can wage war remotely through both drones, but also through various complex missile systems, cruise missile systems. And so the corporations have nothing to gain from diplomatic resolutions to any crisis, and everything to gain from presenting the next big toy of death that the United States absolutely must have to kill whoever the new bad guy is in the never-ending war that now has been embraced by both Democrats and Republicans in the United States.
At the end of 2015, you released the drone papers, which you also call the assassination complex. Could you talk about the drone papers and specifically Germany's role in it?
Well, there was an event that I spoke at in Berlin recently where there was a representative of the German Foreign Office there. And it was a debate with an excellent, heroic human rights lawyer, Wolfgang Kalik, who's a friend and also one of the great lawyers that has pursued Donald Rumsfeld in an attempt to hold him criminally responsible for torture and other abuses. But Wolfgang had agreed, or the Foreign Office agreed to do this if he was not directly asked by the panelists about the role of Ramstein Air Force Base or Germany in the so-called war on terror. But I wasn't bound by that agreement. So I got up in the audience, just watching like everyone else, my panel had finished, and I went to town on this guy. And he basically said, and you can find this, it's online, he basically said, the reason that we are allowing the United States to use facilities within Germany is because the US is a powerful country and we can't say no to them. That's an astonishing admission and really raises questions about how the German Foreign Office views its own, the sovereignty of its own country on these matters. But Germany is not just sort of like a passive victim here that, oh, the big bad United States is sneaking around using our backyard. No, Germany knows damn well what goes on at Ramstein Air Force Base. They know that it's where the key uplinks are that are used for the overwhelming majority of drone strikes in the world, and they're fine with it. They're absolutely fine with it. If they weren't, they would do something about it. German courts, German political figures are all complicit in almost every drone strike, including those that have killed children, civilians, potentially German citizens. Germany is fully complicit in this. The other thing is that at Stuttgart, you have US Africa Command, which is actively plotting assassinations and has carried out assassinations throughout East Africa, using Germany as a place where they are plotting, planning, orchestrating, and coordinating lethal operations. We also know that the German government is being sued because it appears as though Germany has, on a number of occasions, provided intelligence to the United States on German citizens or German residents so that the United States can kill them in drone strikes. I think those are extremely important cases, and Germany is trying to essentially escape its own culpability in this, even on a good day, where they'll say, oh, well, we can't really control what the Americans do. Bullshit. It's Germany is its own country. If it wanted to, it could shut this down. It won't do it. And the question is, why? And the answer, the best answer I've heard is because America's powerful and we do what we tell them. Wow, that's really pathetic, German government.
Here in the United States, we have what we call the military-industrial complex. In this arrangement, the government taxes all of us, borrows a lot of money in order to buy the products of capitalist enterprises who make guns and bullets and planes and tanks and rockets. For these companies, once the government buys it, they are no longer interested. They're now going to reproduce the next tank, the next bullet, the next rocket ship, because for them, the profit is in the buying by the government. The problem for the government then is, what do we do with all of this stuff? And there is a danger for capitalism, because if the government keeps accumulating it, well, then it's going to lead some innocent people to say, well, we have a lot of it, so why do we keep taxing our people to buy even more of it? At that point, the military understands they have an incentive to shoot this stuff into the nearest desert or the nearest ocean or the nearest forest in order to justify the economic role they know they occupy as buyers of capitalist output. So then you begin to see that war becomes, as it is for the United States now for decades. That's really half of what is going on in Iraq or in Libya or in Afghanistan or many other places. It is a chance for the military to keep using up what they have bought as the rationale to keep on buying it. And this has now become so large that it has become an untouchable political reality, because the capitalisms of the West have come to depend on government purchases for the military to an extent that keeps war going independent of global politics.
According to a report by the Department of Defense dated June 2015, there are 44,660 US troops stationed in Germany. It is estimated that there are circa, and reports vary, but let me just point this out, 170 military installations, and one of the most vital being Ramstein, where drone operations, as you know, are conducted from there. What do you think is the view of the U.S. political and military establishment towards Germany today? Is there any significant change since what you've described before?
Well, if you go back to the early 50s, there was always concern that Europe might move in an independent direction, independent of US power. It might become what was called at the time a third force in international affairs. Now, the dominant force was the United States. The second force was the junior superpower, Russia, Soviet Union. And there was concern that Europe, which is of course a rich, developed, advanced area, might just move in an independent direction. There were various proposals for this, like de Gaulle advocated what he called a Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals, including the major parts of Russia, major developed parts of Russia. Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik was another move in that direction. And the US was always concerned with it. In fact, one of the functions of NATO, it's generally understood, was to ensure that Europe would remain under the US aegis, would not move towards an independent direction. And those concerns still exist, and in some ways are even greater. Europe does have the capacity under German initiative to move in an independent direction. And there's some steps in that direction. In fact, it's very current, in fact. Take, say, the Iran nuclear deal that was just made. The European powers, Germany, France, are very enthusiastic about it. They're moving directly to try to reestablish commercial other relations with Iran. The ministers of the government or corporation executives are flocking to Tehran to try to set up deals and arrangements. It's not happening from the United States. On the contrary, it's even possible that the U.S. might undermine the agreement, not the executive, but Congress might find ways to undermine the agreement. In fact, if you take a look at the Republican primaries taking place right now, just about every leading candidate has said that when he's elected, he's going to cancel the agreement. In fact, several of them have said, when we're elected, we're going to bomb Iran. Now, that's quite different from the European attitude. And it's one of a number of ways, there are quite a few, in which Europe and the United States, or the dominant elements in the United States, are following different paths. This kind of conflict has existed for a long time. As I say, it goes back to the early 50s, and it takes different forms at different times. With US power declining in the world relatively to others, it's still overwhelmingly dominant, but it is declining. The options for Europe increase, might move in that direction. And of course, Europe means primarily Germany.
In September of this year, the US announced that it will be sending around 20 new type of B-6112 nuclear bombs here in Germany at the Büchel Air Base. Each of these bombs has 80 times the explosive power of the nuclear bomb that exploded in Hiroshima. And most notably, German taxpayers will cover 1/5 of these costs. Do you think that Germany is violating Article 1 and 2 of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which it ratified, I think, in 2003?
Well, these treaties are somewhat vague in their formulation, so whether it's an explicit violation is a kind of technical question. The more important question is, should Germany be doing it? And in my view, absolutely not. The existence of nuclear weapons is a major threat to survival. If you look over the record of the past 70 years, it's a virtual miracle that we've survived, literally. There are a number of times when the world has come literally a few minutes from a terminal nuclear war. So in 1979, for example, there was the US automated response systems had detected what they determined to be a Russian attack. The reaction should have been a preemptive nuclear strike on Russia. The National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, was virtually on the telephone to tell the president, authorize a nuclear attack, when information came in saying it was a false alarm. In 1983, a couple of years later, the Reagan administration was carrying out simulated attacks against Russia to test Russian defenses. Operation Able Archer, it was called, including nuclear threats. The Russians took it pretty seriously, it turns out. And there was a major, we now know that it was a real war scare. Right at that time, the Russian automated systems detected what they took to be an American missile attack. The protocol was for, there was a single human being named Stanislav Petrov who was supposed to take those reports, hand them over to the high command, in which case there probably would have been a preemptive strike. He just decided not to do it. And that's why we're here talking about it. And there are many other cases like that, including real adventurism, Cuban Missile Crisis, others, complicated story. But to maintain these systems is, at every moment, raises the possibility of a serious nuclear attack. And remember, an attack by any major power will destroy the attacker, even if there's no response, because of the effects of nuclear winter. It's been understood for decades. So to try to increase these threats is grotesque. They ought to be reduced, not increased, if we intend to survive. And now is a period of considerable tension where something could break out over Ukraine, maybe over Syria, and so on. The expansion of NATO to the borders of Russia after the Soviet Union collapsed was, I think, a serious error of policy, not just error, it's understatement. And it's a large part of the problem that's leading to the Ukraine confrontation now. This, incidentally, was in violation of verbal promises, not written ones, but verbal promises to Gorbachev, who thought that the unification of Germany would mean no expansion to the east. It was not the US view. So these are really dangerous developments, I think.
I want to talk about some single examples and work onto the greater mechanisms that are at work here. So Germany recently dropped a case that was investigating the abuses of the NSA, which was revealed by Edward Snowden's whistleblowing actions. And details included such as eavesdropping on our chancellor's cell phone, even collecting metadata of 20 to 30 million German citizens on a regular basis. And this investigation was dropped. And if we look back a decade, El Masri, a German national, was detained in a holiday in Macedonia by the CIA and extradited to Egypt, where he was tortured extensively, and it was later determined that he's innocent. Now, in both cases, our prosecution went after it, but at the federal level, it was dropped at some point. And we've come to know that US is at play here. So what mechanisms are at play here that always align German policy to US interests?
Germany and France and other European countries have, their governments have made a decision to subordinate themselves to US power. It shows up in these ways and many others. You recall when the president of Bolivia, Evo Morales, happened to fly to Moscow and was flying back to Bolivia in a plane that had diplomatic immunity, of course. The European countries, including Germany and France, just wouldn't let him go through their airspace, obviously on US orders. The US thought that maybe Snowden was on board, so they wouldn't let him enter the airspace. The plane was finally had to land in Austria, where it was invaded by Austrian police in violation of every imaginable diplomatic convention to find out if Snowden was on it. All of this is it's kind of pitiful. It's a revelation of real cowardice in the face of power that the European elites are unwilling to confront. It's a sign of subordination and real lack of dignity and integrity, in my view. And the cases you mentioned are examples. The idea that there are, I think, by now 4 Latin American countries that offer asylum to Snowden. Not one European country. In fact, they won't even let him cross their borders. Why? Because the master in Washington tells them we don't want him to. And Snowden, it's important to recall, performed an enormous service, a patriotic service, in fact, to the people of the United States and the world. He revealed to the population what your government is doing to you. That's just what he should have done. That's the responsibility of a decent citizen. The idea that he should be punished for this is really grotesque, and that Europe participates in it is even worse. Same is true of Assange.
And so to understand NATO, which provides ultimately the foundation for the U.S. having the Ramstein base, it was designed as not only to contain the Soviet Union, which really was not a threat in 1949, but also to cap German militarism and to reinforce U.S. control over Western Europe. And Ramstein has been a central pillar in all of this. So on the one hand, to understand its political and military function within Europe, but then, as we know, Ramstein played a central role in the continuing war in Afghanistan, a war fought in violation of the UN Charter, and which has had devastating consequences for the people of Afghanistan. And as you know, Ramstein is the center of AFRICOM. And unknowns to most people here in the United States, the U.S. military is deeply active across Africa right now. In part, it's in response to Boko Haram and Islamist terrorism. But at the same time, it's there to reinforce U.S. access and control over the resources and markets of Africa, and to reinforce our competition with China for influence in Africa. I would add that back during the Cold War, we did a tour of, toward the end of the Cold War, we did a tour principally of women who came from communities where there were U.S. military bases. And I remember very well her talking about how planes had basically used German school buses as targets for simulated attacks, coming within 30 feet or so of, totally terrorizing the children. So it's had a deep impact. The idea that these bases provide economic stability, it's part of the propaganda designed to keep them there. Sure, there are some people who make with their shops and sometimes with prostitution are making money off of the bases, but alternative economic development is fundamentally important and possible. I guess I would add, being Jewish, there's some jobs that simply should not exist. Concentration camps, for example, or the extermination camps in Germany and Europe during the Nazi rule. Well, they sure created jobs, but those were jobs that shouldn't have existed. And these foundations of war, empire, the possibility of nuclear war, these are simply jobs that should not exist, and the money should be used for real development and human needs.
There's a lot of movements taking place around Europe, whether it's Fridays for Future or the movement against the recent copyright law on the upload filter or the Yellow Vest movements in France. However, there's little to no action when we compare to the 70s and 80s, or if we compare to these movements on militarization. Even though Western military budgets have been increasing billions, if not trillions. For example, the United States spends $643 billion, whereas the European NATO countries spend $246 billion annually. And we're not only talking about the financial costs, I'm also talking about the opportunity costs where this money could have otherwise been spent, and of course the social cost of the people that are on the other receiving end of all these military weapons. The atomic scientists, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, have cited the removal of arms treaties as well as nuclear modernization as a grave threat. What is your assessment on this, and should movements also incorporate a stance against militarization?
Yes, of course they should. And yes, indeed, we are falling into a false sense of safety after the collapse of the Cold War. The clock is edging closer to midnight, the doomsday clock, simply because we have a new arms race. We have new players in that arms race. And we have militarization playing the role of a stabilization mechanism for a highly unstable financial capitalism. But you mentioned something which is quite correct, the fact that we don't have the peace movement and generally the massive demonstrations that we used to have in the 1960s and the 1970s. The reason is really very simple and very sad. These are deflationary times. Your generation, I'm saying yours because you're younger than me, had the bad fortune of experiencing 1929 all over again in 2008. And just like after 1929, there was a period of deflation, negative interest rates, of rubbish jobs replacing good quality jobs. These deflationary periods are not periods of activism. They're periods of depression, both economic and psychological. You'll recall that in the 60s and 70s it was inflationary periods. Inflationary periods have their problems, but at the same time they generate protests and they generate activism on the streets.
So where is all of this militarization leading, and what effects does it have on our social fabric?
Yeah, so militarization is immoral, unsustainable, untenable, and it needs to be rolled back very quickly. And let me just summarize by saying when Pearl Harbor was bombed at the start of the Second World War, the United States declared a state of emergency. It took 6 months to militarize our economy to a wartime footing. Well, we now have a new kind of emergency. It's called a climate emergency. We need to declare a state of national and international emergency based on the climate. And we need to finally roll back that militarized economy and change it over to a green and peaceful economy. That can happen also in 6 months if we decided to do that. So the bottom line is, whether we are talking about the climate emergency or the nuclear weapons emergency, among those weapons you mentioned, there are 2,000 of them. Excuse me, 2,000 nuclear weapons which are on hair trigger alert between the U.S.
Explain that.
On hair trigger alert means that they're ready for sending. You know, all they need is the red button to be pushed
By Donald Trump.
by Donald Trump or by a drunken supervisor.
Drunken monkey.
Yes, a drunken monkey, for example. Yes, there are, or for a false alert to be sent. There are many ways that those weapons could be triggered, and we are really sitting at the edge of potential catastrophe with nuclear weapons being what they are. And again, the press doesn't let you know that in fact there is a new treaty, a global treaty proposed at the United Nations by the majority of the world's nations to ban our nuclear weapons. We could all sign that treaty right now. What's happening on the Korean Peninsula should be happening all over the world, including in Syria and far beyond. So the bottom line is we could move from a nuclear, militarized, lethal economy to a green and sustainable economy and address in one fell swoop not only the dangers of war, we can turn the tide on climate change, and in fact we can make wars for oil obsolete, wars for oil and fossil fuel pipelines and the rest. We can make the whole war machine obsolete by essentially greening our economies and our energy supply to start with.
We think it's so important that we hear the stories about the victims and their families, and that if the corporate media in the United States actually told these stories, I think there would be a very different outlook that people would have towards these wars. For example, when the US invaded Afghanistan right after the 9/11 attacks in the United States, I realized that we were not going to see the innocent victims. And a week after the bombing started, I became very determined to go to Afghanistan and see for myself. And so we ended up taking several groups to Afghanistan to meet with these victims. And one of the most heartbreaking journeys was with people who had lost their loved ones during the attacks in Wall Street on 9/11, going to meet with people in Afghanistan who had lost their loved ones to US bombs. And I remember one particular woman that we met with. She was a mother of 7 children, and her home was destroyed, her husband killed because they happened to have a house that was near a military base. And she had heard that the United States was a good country. She thought, oh my God, they must not know what happened. She wrote her whole story with the help of a neighbor because she was an illiterate woman, and took it to the US Embassy in Kabul to see if she could get a meeting and try to get an apology and some compensation so she could take care of her surviving children. She was shooed away at the embassy door and told that we don't meet with beggars. And when she told us this story, we were all crying and said, we'll go with you to the embassy. And so imagine these people from New York City taking this woman in a burqa in Afghanistan to the doors of the US Embassy and demanding that she have a meeting with people inside. And this was one example where we worked to get her some compensation. Of course, you know, it's very hard to talk about compensation for the loss of your husband and your children, but we also have to recognize that these are people that have no money and need some way to survive. And in other cases, we have met with people who have lost their loved ones to drone strikes. I remember going to Yemen and meeting with a man who must have been in his late 30s, and he brought 2 young children with him who were his brother's children. His brother was a school teacher, and to make more money for the family's needs, he used to moonlight as a taxi driver. And one day when he was driving his taxi, some strangers got into the taxi, and 20 minutes later it was blown up by a Hellfire missile from a drone strike, and his brother was incinerated. He brought the 2 children so we could see that these children would never see their father again, that his young wife would never see her husband again. And he said that he was from a large tribe, and said his tribe never had anything to do with the United States, barely knew what the United States was, but now everybody in the tribe hates the United States.
وصلنا والسيارة تحترق بمن عليها، والأشلاء متناثرة في محيط السيارة حول 150 متر أو 200 متر. جمعوا الأشلاء إلى أكياس، وقمنا بتجميع الأشلاء وطفاء السيارة. كانت يعني ممزقة الأشلاء، والمنع وسير متفحم يعني لا يعرف منهم أحد. والجثث الذي بعثرت خلال السيارة أنصاف جثث، يعني ما عاد بشي تلقى جمجمة واحد ورجل واحد ويد واحد. يعني منظر نعاني من نفسيا إلى اليوم. يعني كل ما يجسل الصورة مرسومة في ذهني ما رضيت فارق ذهني أبدا.
And it was a very strong example to me about how things like these drone strikes perpetuate the cycle of violence. In a place like Yemen, revenge is part of the culture, and it's not just one generation. It might well go on for other generations. So we are planting the seeds of hatred and building enemies for decades to come. I have also been to Pakistan, where the US drones have been killing people, particularly in Waziristan, met with school teachers, met with tribal leaders, met with people who were the the peacemakers in their community and had been killed by U.S. drone strikes. And similar to the cases of Yemen, realized that we are just creating enemies and killing so many innocent people without apologizing, without acknowledging if indeed these were mistakes, and without compensating the families. And in the case of Pakistan, we were saying that any young man of military age in the areas where we were using these drone strikes were militants. And so it was okay to kill them without knowing if indeed they were involved in militant activity. And on top of that, it's important to say, what does militant activity mean? Because shouldn't the US just be protecting itself from people who are trying to kill Americans? I don't think anybody in Waziristan is trying to kill people in the United States. There are internal conflicts going on that the United States should not get involved in. And unfortunately, that is happening all over the world.
I don't know the exact numbers because I think the official account isn't there, and there's so many secret operations going on, secret bases. But I think it's something like over 150 countries, over 1,200 installations. It's not like we don't, as journalists, look at America as America. If it was Great Britain today in that position, or if it was India today in that position with that military scope, we'd be probably criticizing them. And what I don't seem to understand is when there's a military footprint on this planet and the wars in Libya and Iraq, why do we still cannot call the empire to what it is?
Yeah, people think I'm talking about Star Wars when I speak about the U.S. empire. It's amazing to me. We have so many bases that even Pentagon officials won't even tell you the number of bases because there's so many lily pad bases off of that official 900 number that they don't even know. We're talking about 56 military interventions that have subjugated and usurped the democratic processes of in Latin America alone. We're talking about, catastrophic wars that have killed millions, tens of millions of people, the use of chemical warfare, violation of international treaties, exemptions from international treaties. The list goes on and on. But the reason that you don't hear about this is because we're the best country in the world, right? We can do whatever we want. We're not the empire because we're the moral arbitrator of what's right and good and holy. We have the freest media in the world. We have the freest democracy in the world. So of course, when the media works hand in glove with the establishment to sell this notion, right? It's a weapon. The media is a weapon of the empire. It's not just to protect the corporate structure, it's to protect the empire and to sell these wars and narratives. And you see it time and again, Zen, where we just have to keep marginalizing ourselves and fighting on the margins to fight for the truth. Because we're just lambasted with attacks day after day from the corporate media structure.
Like if somebody's sitting here in the crowd or watching on YouTube and that person wants to actually change the world tomorrow, yeah? What is the first challenge or the challenges that they should take into account? And what is the underlying thing that they should always keep in mind despite the hardships that they face?
I think the context that's missing from all of these trivialities and the stories that you mentioned in your intro. I mean, the daily inundation of these superficialities, we need to understand the context behind them, how we got here. History is instructive. We need to learn from history so we can prevent future wars. We can prevent going down this horrible, disastrous path time and time again, generation after generation. So I think reclaiming and relearning history, understanding how we got here. B, teaching yourself the tools to be media literate and critical thinker. Huge base of support that you have here, Zen, and it's really inspiring for me. And I think this is where it all starts. You start a hub, and the progressive thinkers come to that hub, and they just keep building, and that's how social movements start. That's how progressive movement starts, and that's how we fight and end empire and end wars. We have to challenge that propaganda. We have to unmask the brutality of what's going on. And from there, I think we can find a much better system than what we have now.
Inspiring words, Abby.